Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening to our Black in Design global family. Again, my name is Somala Diby. Some of you may have seen me yesterday, and I am the speaker and program chair for the Black in Design 2021 Steering Committee. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're so excited to present to you our third and final panel of the conference. We had an amazing day yesterday. We had two awesome panels that you can actually watch if you click the replay button on the left-hand side of your hop-in panel. We had a workshop led by Lady Sasha Jones. So we encourage you to read more about her, and we'll be sharing information about her writing following up the conference. We had an incredible guided meditation led by Ashley Wilkerson, and you will see her later today to close us out. And then we ended with a really fun virtual set by Tyler Pakpo. So encourage all of you all to go to the replay and check out what you missed, read about all the speakers, and learn more about them. But today, I'm so excited to announce our third panel, Art, Media, and Black Urban Mobility. To share a little bit about this panel, Black people across the diaspora often use art and media to demarcate urban spaces and personal histories, especially as they are dispossessed of formal ownership of those spaces. Featuring artists, architects, activists, public historians, this panel will explore the role of art and media in enabling everyday Black survival in navigating the city, from murals and monuments that commemorate lives lost to anti-Black police violence, to community-based documentary practices that enable marginalized communities to self-determine. This panel aims to encourage designers to seriously consider the ways to integrate art and media in their practices. So the person who will be moderating our panel is the great Wandy Pascoal. Wandy is an artist and architectural designer who was interested in the ways that housing design and policy come together to shape global urban landscapes. This inquiry led her to her current role as the Housing Innovation Design Fellow, a position co-hosted by the City of Boston's Housing Innovation Lab and the Boston Society for Architecture. In this work, she strives to center the voices of Boston's residents and the complex experiences in order to drive the design and implementation of the city's current and future housing models. Wandy holds a BFA in architecture from UMass Amherst and a Master of Architecture from Mass Art, where she focused on the urban and housing design of a self-sustaining eco-village in her home country of Angola. Previously, she worked as an architectural designer at Stoll and Lee, Inc., focused on affordable housing projects in the New England area. She has also worked with the Madison Park Development Corporation, where she first gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of local services and housing creation. So without further ado, I will present to you Wandy, and she will introduce you all to the rest of the panelists. I hope you all enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Somala. Good morning, everyone, and truly thank you for being here today. We're incredibly grateful to have the chance to welcome you back into this virtual space, and also hope that this conference so far has helped to illuminate a few of the many ways in which we continue to celebrate Black spatial practices from the magical to the mundane. My name is Wandy Pascoal, and I am an Angolan artist, architectural designer, and creator, speaking with you today from the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people, known in our contemporary as Boston, and I have the privilege of moderating today's panel discussion titled Art, Media, and Black Urban Mobility. So because we unfortunately will not be able to see many of you, I certainly invite you to please feel free to use the chat function and comment to introduce yourselves and share where you're writing from. We know that there are folks from so many different parts of the US and the world here today, and we want to make sure to uplift how wonderful it is to be among you all today. And as you do that, I will just ask folks to perhaps bring over the slides so that we can go over this. Perfect. Great. So as you all take some time for intros, I'd like to share the format for today's discussion to give you an idea of what to expect. So we'll begin with our panelists being introduced and sharing a little bit about their work. I will then kick off the conversation by asking questions that draw out key themes and trends for us to consider. And for the second half of our time, we'll open up the floor to give you a chance to ask the questions that have come to mind during the presentation. So we ask that you share those with us throughout the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. So if that sounds okay to everybody, we can certainly get started with our introductions. So this morning we're joined by artists, activists, historians, and most certainly storytellers who through their work explore the role of art and media in enabling Black survival and navigating the city. But what do we mean when we say navigation or even mobility? Mobility can be described as the ability to move or be moved freely, to perhaps even journey across different levels in society. And while at times these transformations happen on the basis of personal choice, we more often than not associate these with violence, with strategic methods of exclusion and displacement, where mobility is enforced rather than a choice. And when enforced, it can be a product of the exploration of commodities such as human lives or natural resources, which in turn limits or makes impossible any hope for movement, particularly in a time where we've witnessed a period of racial reckoning at a national and global scale, an ongoing global pandemic, and are more and more impacted by rapid climate change. Today, we'd like you all to consider not only the themes that span across the three presentations from our panelists, but also the methods and methodologies for how to bring together communities and collectives to externalize their own visions of liberation and autonomy. Each presentation will elaborate on the nuances and complexities of what it means to do this work across geographical, environmental, and racial contexts, and together they'll shed light on the lessons that we may all be able to learn from one another. So, Jamila Pewu, Michael Uwemedimo, and Jordan Weber will present on the importance of the use of art and media over time and space. We know that such efforts stand to help us all collectively build pathways towards cultural and historical resilience. So please welcome me in joining and welcoming our panelists. And I know that we can't see you all, but please feel free to again use the chat to give a warm welcome to all three. Thank you. And we can certainly stop sharing the slides, and I will give a quick introduction to our first panelist. So we'll be hearing from Jamila Pewu, who is a public and digital historian whose work explores how and why groups and individuals reimagine the spaces around them to create new urban futures. She is particularly interested in examining the concept of reimagining through the unique historical, geographic, and methodological perspectives posed by African diasporic and or Black Atlantic communities, both past and present. As Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities and New Media and History at California State University, Fullerton, Dr. Pewu leads the History Department's Digital Humanities initiatives. In addition, she teaches survey and upper division courses in U.S. history, African history, and historical research and writing. Welcome, Jamila.
Thank you, Wandy. And thank you all for coming out this morning. I'm glad to be here and with my co-panelists as well. And thank you to the Black in Design Organization Committee for organizing such a great event. I'm ready for my slides. So as we've just learned, the conditions that make urban spaces livable, walkable, affordable, and hospitable for Black communities are ever changing, thereby making the process of fully belonging to the urban environment tenuous for some and impossible for others. Ultimately, these feelings of unbelonging are indicative of larger human rights abuses, which limit and shape urban communities for urban outcomes for racial and ethnic minorities, as well as quasi-minorities such as the elderly. Here, I embrace an expanded definition of human rights, first posed by Clyde Woods in 2002 and articulated more recently in 2018 by a CFP by Janie Scott and Jonathan Gomez, who expanded to include everything from houselessness to educational apartheid to the denial of egalitarian public spaces. And so the question that comes up for me as somebody whose historical practice is deeply engaged in Black spatial matters, and in particular, the use of digital tools and technologies such as mapping to assist communities who are in danger of being wiped off the map, are how do we navigate these uncertain terrains while also making room for new spatial possibilities? So specifically, I ponder this through three primary methodological questions that affect my role, my toolkit, and potential outcomes. So first, how do the conflictual processes of redevelopment, reimagining, and even remaining in the city today compel us to adopt dual or hyphenated identities like scholar activist, community liaison, or even urban agitator? Second, how do the constant questions of belonging and unbelonging, which are at the heart of modern discussions of human rights in post-industrial and post-colonial landscapes, implore us to adopt a mixed bag of tools that combine art, new media, and memory work within a community-engaged research praxis? And finally, could such practices, if engaged in the right place and time, illuminate new possibilities for being Black and urban against an unstable landscape? So I just want to briefly share a couple projects that I've worked on and that I'm currently working on, in which I work through some of these methodological questions. Both projects engage art as a counter mapping strategy, in particular to address issues of unbelonging and Black spatial alienation. The first is the exhibit Reimagining Little Liberia, Restoration and Reunion. And this exhibit came about based upon my doctoral research in the Little Liberia neighborhood of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And in this project, I worked with local historians and artists to help visually and intellectually recover and reimagine this endangered historic place that was once populated by Black and Native American peoples, but had since been only registered as a blighted or forgotten neighborhood. The houses remained dormant, houses that once occupied a very influential role in this 19th century Black peri-urban community were forgotten up through the 20th century. And it wasn't until the 1990s when a local historian discovered their historic value that the efforts to save them kicked into gear. However, that process was not overnight and is still ongoing, which caused many people in this city whose ancestry hails from the Black community and even from this Little Liberia community to question, where are the monuments that tell their stories and their histories? So this exhibit emerged as one way to do that. And I just want to give an example of how the exhibit uses art as a practice in counter mapping. So we see in this older historical map here, this was from the 19th century, and all of the residents and houses in the city proper are listed on this map, except for, if you see this small circle here, where this Little Liberia community was at. It was empty, almost as if they didn't exist. There was an erasure of their place in the city. Then on this smaller black and white map, the local historian who first discovered the site, Charles Brovich, recreated this section, and he went and reinscribed the names of those people who had been left off the 19th century map. Now that was a feat in and of itself, but there was still more that we needed. There was still more that we needed in order to make this site come alive to the people who lived in this city. So through the artists and scholars workshops we held, we invited scholars or artists to listen to local historians, myself and others, talk about the history of this site, and then to take whatever aspect of it spoke most to them and go and create something in their own mediums. This piece was produced by John Wright, which provides a bird's eye view, and it was specifically done as a counter map to that first 19th century map in which the people had been purposefully left off the landscape of Bridgeport, Connecticut. The second project that I'm engaged in right now is one in which we're using digital mapping to document, preserve, and critically engage the spatial narratives and public art practices that emerged during the 2020 protests for Black lives and racial justice. And this project is called Art of the Matter. It builds upon a 2018 project, but takes it even further by really questioning how can we stretch the use of deep mapping and digital storytelling to create interventions into the urban landscape. This is a great quote by Ara Hyder, who wrote that during the 2020 protests for Black Lives, in which you saw a flowering of public art on plywood, similar to this piece from Long Beach, California, that in a year when history is being emphatically questioned and where a global pandemic has shut conventional galleries and museums, street art also highlights a diversity of viewpoints. And I thought that quote kind of framed this project well. So this project engages in radical, deep, and counter mapping practices through the public arts landscape. In particular, it asks, how do we track erasure? So in the first example here, we're looking at this is a prototype of the site, but we're looking at this to see how we can use a timeline feature and to be able to show the raised building profiles or structures that once housed the ephemeral murals or other public art pieces that are now whitewashed, so that we can actively map for erasure on the public art landscape. Another methodological question we consider in this project is, how do we tell neighborhood stories? And by conducting interviews with artists, benefactors, or others who are involved in the creation of a particular art piece, as well as local residents and passersby, we're aiming to tell stories that not just kind of pin these sites on a map, but also talk about the artworks themselves and also the block or the neighborhood in which they are in. What happened when this area met this artist and they created this artwork? And how did that change the way people saw themselves in those spaces? So I just want to end by saying that I think in both of these examples, I'm really relying on this idea posed by Toni Morrison that the best art is unquestionably political and irrevocably beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. It is so wonderful to hear you present on this work that's really at the intersection of mapping and storytelling. And I know that folks will have many, many questions to ask you a little later on, but I'd like to welcome to the virtual stage and introduce Michael Uwemedimo, who is a current Loeb Fellow at the GSD, is also the co-founder and director of the Collaborative Media Advocacy Platform and Senior Visiting Research Fellow at King's College London. As a founding member of the filmmaking collaboration Vision Machine and a producer of the Academy Award-nominated BAFTA-winning documentary The Act of Killing, he has been developing innovative approaches to documentary practices as a means of enabling critical reflection on histories of political violence and challenges to official impunity. Michael is co-founder and project director of the Human City Project, a community-driven media, architecture, planning, and human rights initiative in Nigeria. There, he explores design processes through which violently marginalized urban communities might gain a greater measure of control over their representation and the shaping of their cities. Michael has curated major programs at the National Film Theatre, Tate Modern, Architecture Association, and Institute for Contemporary Art London, sat on international film festival juries, and presented his research and work internationally. And so please welcome me in joining or join me in welcoming Michael to the stage. Thank you.
Hi, thrilled to be here. Could I get my slides up, please? Thanks. Okay, before saying anything, I just want to show a short clip from a video which should give some sense of the context that the project responds to.
They came 7:30. They came with their bulldozers and they came with their soldiers.
Yeah, this way. Front, go front. Forward. Step. That side, then go this side. Police on that side. You cannot come this side. Come this way. Come this way. This way. Come inside. Come and see.
After demolishing my place, I don't have where to stay. I hung around for 2 weeks. No money. I don't expect that that day they will come and demolish that place with Wandy. So now I hang around with my children, with 6 children. I hang around, I don't have a place to stay. Even they have money to pack my things to play, I don't have. Me, I'm not a lazy woman. I'm not a criminal, I'm not a militant. I'm a struggling woman. I do business. I do petty trade, rice, beans, tomatoes, I sell. I go to and buy things and sell. I'm not a lazy woman. I'm an industrious woman. I do business. I'm a struggling woman. And now the government frustrates me. There's no way to. Even all my property was scattered, my things, my business was scattered. No way to now to start even the business. No way to manage. No way even to put my children in the school. That place is our home, where we brought up. Are we supposed to be in refugees in our own lands?
Port Harcourt is a city in the creeks, and for 500 years, this swampy elbow of Africa has been one corner of a black Atlantic that was busy with the global trade of dark cargo. First human beings, then palm oil, and now sweet crude. From the start, colonial cartography has figured black in the design of its dark margins, and these margins frame the cultures and logistics of extraction. Here's a map ostensibly drawn by a newly independent Nigerian government, but look closely at the legend and you learn it was compiled from imagery by Shell BP. The map of the region was literally drawn by Shell. After oil, oil is the commodity of dark mobility, which at its source has rendered much black immobility. The material violence of extraction and the social violence of segregation are inscribed into the city's master plan, with its native barracks and European quarter. The formal designs of the master plan is long overwhelmed by oil-fueled growth of self-built communities along the city's waterfronts. Here, most people live. Here, the state is absent. Here, the future of the city is being contested. This is not some marginal situation. This is the core urban condition. And on current trajectories, this is the future. To the extent that there is state intervention, this is its face: violence by design. These could be post-natural disaster scenes, the aftermath of an earthquake or a tsunami, but they're not. These are scenes from one of the dominant modes of African urbanism, one whose field opens in the stark gap between the urban realities of cities like Port Harcourt and the urban fantasies of the political class. A field where the quiet encroachment of the urban majority meets violent dispossession by the urban elite. In this context, we've been developing the Human City Project to collaborate with people from overlooked communities to allow them to make themselves seen and heard, and to take greater control over the shaping of their city. Ours is a community-led media, music, architecture, urban design, and human rights initiative. We're looking to let people in. And it may seem perverse in the face of such overwhelming and immediate violence, such as we saw in the opening clip, to start with cinema, but that's where we started. Perhaps you noticed, even in that short clip, how people directed and protected the camera. Immediately, they seized it as an instrument that could be used to show what mattered to them. And so our pop-up Chikoko Cinema is an inflatable mobile screen putting overlooked people in the picture. Chikoko Radio is a youth-led station building citywide audiences, part of the suite of technologies of light and voice that we're building together. Chikoko Sounds is a production facility for young people to make music and to share it. And we're also building shelters for voice. This is our media shed. It's a light at night place to gather. And we work with hundreds of young women and men from the city's informal settlements so that they can tell their stories on film, on air, and in court, chart their reality on maps, and describe their visions in action plans. And with them, we're building Chikoko Space, an iconic community arts and advocacy building that will gather all these platforms under a single roof. We're not just designing a building, we're building a movement. And for us, it's important that we're not fetishizing architecture as if a building could be the panacea. So we developed Chikoko Maps, a participatory research and planning program, giving people the power to put themselves on the map and articulate different city scales. We have handsome charts and deep data. As well as mapping the streets, we took to the streets with a simple message: people live here. For that message, the government met us with bullets and bulldozers. And more recently, the End SARS protest, the anti-police brutality protest that took off nationwide, which we covered and participated in. And finally, I just want to show you a few other images from the Chikoko crew. As we're here speaking about Black in design, here are some of the crew's experiments with shedding light on themselves in the dark beautifully. And I just want to give the final word to the crew in Port Harcourt. So if we could just show this short video, and I'm done. Thank you.
My heart's a radio, it only beats for the truth. We want a station that can speak out for the youths, where our stories make the news. When we have options, we would choose to watch facts instead of fiction. Reality is no sci-fi, no green screen picture. It's our story, what do we need a script for? Don't try to sugarcoat the bitterness of being poor.
Radio cinema, maps and suicide. When we have the space, we'll do it big. For now, we'll do it small. Great opportunity to break the wall of setback, oppression, and forced eviction. In the slum, create a space for our dreams and vision. Put ourselves in the map, be a part of the city. People live here, we want to live free. Yeah. We want to live free. Chikoko, radio cinema, maps and suicide. Chikoko collective.
You know, nothing's a waste if it can't be managed. The higher the carbon, more risks to the climate. Clean up our world, one plastic at a time. Chikoko music to the world, our story and our song. When we got the space, we do it big, now let's do it small. People live here and we want
Mama, Mama and Sosa, Chikoko Collective.
We are Chikoko Collective, supported by CIMA.
Thanks.
Michael, what a beautiful, beautiful note to end on. And as someone from a country whose economy is also so heavily influenced by oil, I can't help but see so many parallels in the stories you've shared. Very much looking forward to unpacking this a little later on. Finally, and certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Jordan Weber to the virtual stage. Jordan Weber, also a current Loeb Fellow at the GSD, is a Des Moines-based regenerative land sculptor and environmental activist who works at the cross-section of social justice and environmental racism. Most recently, Jordan was commissioned by the Walker Arts Center to create an urban farm in North Minneapolis called Prototype for Poetry versus Rhetoric, Deep Roots, which acts as a counter-tactic to industrial violence upon biodiverse lands and racially diverse communities. The project was produced in collaboration with North Minneapolis community members during the height of the George Floyd protests in late May 2020. He's currently in residence at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation and Washington University Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, and Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts. Jordan's 2-year project residency centers on social and environmental justice, incarceration, and healing, with a specific focus on the Close the Workhouse campaign, a collaborative project that is dedicated to the closure of St. Louis's Medium Security Institute, known locally as the Workhouse. Awards and fellowships include the Joan Mitchell Award for Sculptures, Creative Capital NYC Award, a Blade of Grass Fellowship NYC, Tan Foundation Art, and the African American Leadership Forum Award. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm sitting here. I've known Michael for about 3 or 4 months, and I'm sitting here shaking from some of the imagery. And it's really the first time I've engaged in his work or seen the work, especially the Chikoko space and the Chikoko Collective. So, Michael, it seems we have a lot more to talk about. I'm also really pleased to be here with you guys this morning. And with that, can you activate my slides, Matt? So I really wanted to start with a tipping point in my practice. 2014 going into 2015, we saw and felt and witnessed the murder of Michael Brown in St. Louis, Missouri, specifically Ferguson, Missouri. And the tipping point of my practice was at this site of the 2014-2015 protests. And here, this image instead is showing, countless harmed and wounded Black bodies. I wanted to really show a photo that was taken by myself and a friend of young Black men in Ferguson, Missouri, holding a hand up, not to show that they are unarmed, but to show, hold on a second, I'm going to see if I can't get my 4-month-old calm. Sorry, guys. But not to show that they're unarmed, but more so to show that they've had to put mitts and oven mitts on their hands to throw back tear canisters so they wouldn't burn their hands. And this image has, and these individuals have really stuck with me for about the past, 5-6 years since we encountered them on the street in Ferguson, Missouri. And with that, I was invited in 2015 to create a piece for Manifest Justice in Los Angeles, specifically Crenshaw, to act as some sort of installation or centerpiece to an arts exhibition that had countless individuals, former Black Panthers, former mothers of killed young Black men from police brutality speaking at this exhibition in collaboration with Ron Finley. And if you guys don't know who Ron Finley is, all you have to do is Google him. He's known for coining the phrase gangster gardener, and he supplied all the plants for this exhibition. And the reason I call 2014, 2015 a tipping point in my practice is because I realized that the 2D imagery in my exhibitions and in my gallery exhibitions weren't really having an impact for our Midwest community specifically. So I started thinking about larger installations and how to create interactive pieces. With that piece, I really didn't feel like it was successful still. You know, it was on the front page of the Los Angeles Times Arts and Culture section. I got my foot in the door of getting some awards and some grants to do larger works, larger scaled exhibitions. But in 2016, after working with the community of North Omaha for about 4 or 5 years, I was given the opportunity to activate Malcolm X's birth site, where his birth home once stood. And here in North Minneapolis, or in North Omaha, we see about 7 acres of pristine land that once housed Malcolm X and his community. So that was once a street in North Omaha. The idea of the project was to work with the Omaha community to activate that space in a way that would be beneficial to the Omaha community. And we came up with the idea of erecting a greenhouse, and not just a greenhouse in the light of food sovereignty, but a greenhouse for spiritual reflection and practice. So there's actively Zen meditation and Salah prayer at this site. But this is a work in progress, right? So much like Michael said, not, thinking of architecture as some sort of panacea. This is one element that I feel like can activate a space or activate a green space in a way to empower ourselves and our community to do other things, right? To build on landscape and to build on architecture as a starting point or a foundation. And I really wanted to show this image because recently I secured a Creative Capital grant to plant a Three Sisters garden with 3 very close friends of mine from the Omaha, the Ponca, and the Osage tribe. And if you saw that site today, it's about a 300 by 200 plot of space behind that greenhouse of Three Sisters plants. So if you guys know anything about that, it's beans, corns, and squash. And with this, we see another shift in my practice to collaborate with not only the local Black communities that have been redlined so heavily in our country, but also integrating the indigenous communities into the projects. And I think it was maybe 3 months after the killing of George Floyd, 2 months, Omaha had a massive movement that met at the greenhouse to protest the murder of another African-American, in which an individual in that crowd was killed by a white bar owner in Omaha. So at that time, I'm always thinking about how do we create architectural structures that can act as a safe space for our community? And I've been conceiving and building these panopticons, or these reverse panopticons in the Midwest, to activate sites mobilely as a mobile unit, mobile libraries and Zendos. And these are smaller projects that aren't as successful, but you see what I'm getting at. I'm trying to activate sites in a larger, more impactful manner. And as we see here, the 3rd police precinct was burned to the ground 2019, 2020. And that led to the project at the Walker in North Minneapolis, in which we attempted and are attempting to counter violence on the land from heavily polluted vacant lots and Black communities, as you'll see here, and how that relates to violence upon the Black and brown body, because I don't think there's any there's any gap between the two. I really truly think, especially in the Midwest, with the rate of police violence and the rate of imprisonment of Black males to white males, that and the industrial complex and the heavily polluted industrial residential areas in our Black communities are one and the same. Opening day was about 5 months ago, before I came to Cambridge, as you can see here. And I wanted to give a quick shout out as I end to the people already doing this work in Minneapolis. This may seem, from an arts institution standpoint, that this is something that is new in the Black community in North Minneapolis, but it's something that's been happening for decades. We're just trying to magnify that work, the work that's already been done. And that's the respect I really wanted to end on and pay some tribute to specifically Roger Cummings and Youth Farm from North Minneapolis. And I'll throw it back to you guys.
Thank you, Jordan, for sharing your work with us. I definitely think that your appreciation for architecture, and then more specifically landscape architecture, is one that is so key to the preservation and then also creation of spaces in our built environment. And so I believe that with that, we can actually get started with our conversation and discussion, which I'm really, really excited about. I will also preface this for everybody who's watching today that we had met previously just to get to know one another. And I think that there were a lot of themes that really came out of that conversation that I definitely would like to have the different panelists share a little bit more about, and then also expand on it if at all possible. So the questions that I have prepared are in order of the different speakers. So I will turn to you, Jamila, to go first. And I definitely think that, in many ways, your practice and work really helps to reclaim the complex history of mapping as it relates to Blackness. And so my question is, how has your work served to empower the communities you have and continue to work with today? And then how is this perhaps then complicated when the same practices of self-advocacy can at times make those who wander the world in less surveilled ways actually more hyper-visible in some cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, in the first example that I shared, the Reimagining Little Liberia, that one, that exhibit in which we were really kind of using the exhibit as a way in which, we could counter map what was happening on the landscape, as it were. The city had basically written off that section of Bridgeport, and they had installed 2 public housing projects in the 1940s, 1950s, and left them to kind of neglect, and then took them down in the 90s and never replaced them. So it's basically started a period in which infrastructure, everything that was there, kind of that post-industrial decline, was really magnified. And one of the things that I think that exhibit did was it spurred people to want to know more. So from that actual exhibit, we had housed it at one of the community colleges. And it was only supposed to run for about a few months because they were undergoing some remodeling. And that was in 2017, and it's still installed today. And so the project has really grown in terms of support, but also in terms of knowledge, where you find young students in a city which has a high illiteracy rate who are learning how to become community docents through that exhibit. So it's connecting them deeper to the place in which they live in. We've had a number of other artists who have kind of riffed off of what they learned in the exhibit and created other installations in both music and visual art that have kind of echoed throughout the city. So in that sense, I definitely see that as being a benefit. The other work that I do with that site, with Bridgeport, is I want to place it into this broader Black Atlantic context, in which we really restructure its relationship to its historic narrative, and as one that wasn't simply based in the US, but was really borrowing this idea of freedom that was echoed through the Republic of Liberia, and was really bringing that back to the US at a time in which majority of people of Black people in the US were still enslaved. And so I think in that way, that's another aspect of it that I'm hoping to share in other ways. But I think the question that you ask about, so we see ways in which kind of putting this site on the map in these ways is beneficial. But what happens to communities that have been so neglected and left off to the point where suddenly they're in the spotlight, and then that has unintended consequences? And I think that's a reality as well. So one of the things that I'm always conscientious of are my methods. I'm always checking myself and my collaborators and seeing how can we do this better? How can we be more sensitive to these issues? And really kind of thinking through our methodology as one that is based on this idea of continuous integration. Like, we can never stop questioning what we're doing and how we're doing it and modifying it, so that when we are confronted with those unintended consequences, we are able to respond to them, as opposed to kind of just shoo them away because they don't fit the, you know, the stereotype of what we imagine our work to be. We imagine our work to be positive and to be, empowering, but to really just kind of sit in that messiness and that uneasiness for a while and kind of figure a way, always working with, partnering with communities so that they're not outside of those mapping practices, but they are wholly integrated and a part of them.
Yes, 100% here for all the things that you just mentioned, because you do have to be flexible, over time in order to address the needs that are ever shifting as well. So thank you. So my next question is for Michael, and it is truly centered around storytelling. So when it comes to storytelling, how do you differentiate between the stories that, communities tell one another to learn to come together, to mobilize, to grow, to survive, from those stories that we then tell to a larger audience, perhaps even the audience that is here today, right? That is also oftentimes more affluent. So yeah, what do you choose to cross-reference between those two? And how do you think through this art of storytelling?
We set out with this project to try and change Port Harcourt's plot, thinking about plot in both its narrative sense and its spatial sense. And in doing that, very early on, we had to start thinking about audiences, about who we were telling stories about and to and with. And that led us to develop different platforms, different touch points to try and reach different people. So for example, very early, we developed a series of really rich digital platforms, but lots of the people in the waterfronts who were actually producing the material for those sites had difficulty reaching them. So having a big inflatable cinema means we can get high bandwidth images right into the streets. It's like our internet on the street. So thinking about different platforms for different audiences so that we can reach different people. But we also have tried to think about how we can use stories to give people in the waterfronts more leverage. So I presented the project quite a lot internationally in spaces like this. And I realized some time into the project that I hadn't actually presented the project as I present it outside to people in the project. I figured, why would I? These are the people who have made the project. Why would they need to see a presentation like that? But then I did, and something really powerful happened. People recognize themselves. People recognize themselves as recognized. And they say, that's us. They saw themselves in their own story. And then we realized that the story is really part of the story. And we need to find ways of creating conversations and material connections between different audiences. And that's one of the reasons that I'm here this year, because while our project in many ways has been very impactful and has meant a lot of things to a lot of people, it's wholly inadequate to the scale of the challenge that we're facing, the challenge of imagining a post-oil future in the oil capital of Nigeria. And so one of the things I'm trying to do here is to see how we can really deepen the spatial aspect of plot, how we can build community infrastructures of light and power and use that to change the story and the face of the city.
Most definitely. And I think that question could actually be expanded to all of you here as well, but really interesting to hear how that's unfolded and how you've chosen to retell those stories to the folks who have created them as well. So my next question is for Jordan. So your work really sheds an important light on the ways in which the activation of landscapes can help to build cultural and historical resilience. I think, to use your own terms, these can be, and they can form, survival mechanisms. So my question for you is, can you tell us a little bit more about how your work has supported this form of practice and how it's actually taken root well beyond the timing of the piece itself?
Yeah. Specifically, roots taking on, their own form in totality with the timing of the exhibitions. We know for a fact that urban farms aren't something that are, consistently or, historically sustainable. A lot of individuals in our communities don't own the land that these urban farms are built on. So the idea with the timing of some of the projects and, obviously the larger ones, which is why I'm here as well at Low, is to create some sort of green space that can mitigate pollutants from the air and from the soil on a long-term basis. So when you have the project ending, when you have, due to, a million different reasons, you have these native and indigenous plants, for example, deep-rooted, grasslands built into these projects that will continue to do the work to heal the land after the project ends. And with that, hopefully you've built some sort of space that is still inviting, that can hold up in a way that individuals in that community can enter and re-enter and find, respite and can decompress at these sites. So that's kind of the long-term idea of greening these spaces and revitalizing them is one for decompression for the individual, but also the long-term healing of the land. We know for a fact, for example, an acre of land, grassland, and a urban environment can store about 3,000 pounds per year of carbon. And even more with the forest, but forests take a lot longer to establish. So really what I'm saying is, if the project fails in terms of the sustainability of the gardening and food sovereignty, we still have that project being effective long-term for the revitalization of degraded environments in that community.
Thank you. It also definitely, it makes me think about even some of the mobile work that you presented on today, and the way that can continue on well beyond, you physically being there or somebody else physically being there as well. Great.
Right,
okay.
Right. And those, and I just want to mention those inverted or reverse panopticons aren't that successful of a project. So they look good, but I really want to touch on their shortcomings in some of the work that are still being revisited. Much like Jamila said, so we can adjust and kind of improve some of the activations and engagements in a manner that suits the community better long term.
Yeah. Great. And so I know that we perhaps might have a few questions. And again, to everybody who is listening in / watching, please feel free to continue to use the comment section to share out any specific questions you might have for folks. But I do note that some of the panelists might actually have questions for each other. So I actually will not read them and will invite you to ask them yourselves, because I think that this could be a great point of discussion as well.
Well, I'll go first then. I mean, one of the things I'm really struck by in both Jordan and Jamila's work are the different temporalities that are at play there. So in Jamila's mapping work, we have this active historical recovery, which is trying to make manifest in the present these buried presences, a kind of archaeological performance, trying to perform the past in the present. And in Jordan's work, which is very powerful in its present performance, people coming together in the framed moment of its activation, but the strong sense that really the deep power of that work, when it really flowers or when it takes root, could be many, many years after the project has finished, when it's no longer tended, when it's gone wild, when what has been sowed is really doing its work and growing. And I think that's one of the challenges I'm trying to respond to in Port Harcourt, where we have to contend with geological time, with the extraction of hydrocarbons, essentially the stored solar power of 100 million years and the geothermal power of 1.5 billion years suddenly released. And how to build in a space which has been so blown apart by that explosion, so that it means something to people right now, but can start the long work of transforming everything, the way in which we move from A to B, heat ourselves, clothe ourselves, feed ourselves.
Jamila, do you want to respond to that?
No, you go ahead. I'll add it later.
Yeah, and we kind of had this conversation, and Michael and I have had some, long conversations about this too. How do you generate projects that are so visually striking to the community that is hopefully included in every step of the process? How do you construct something with limited funding, or if you can get larger funding, that can sustain the project, right? So how do you build something to scale that's both effective and aesthetically pleasing enough and culturally stunning enough to make people want to come to it and enact change through that project because of the visual of it? And it's something I think that I'm really conscious of, obviously being a visual artist and having a street art background. But it's also the really exciting thing about being in a space like the Loeb Fellowship here, and hopefully meeting students that want to kind of add something to future projects, is to really blow these sites up to activate space now, because we don't have time for multiple different reasons. So yeah, I can pass it to Jamila if you want to comment on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last point you made is time. Time is not always on our side. That is a reality. I think what I saw, even as both Michael and Jordan were speaking, is that there is this sense that the environmental impacts that are affecting the spaces that we're working in are kind of need to be contended with, both now but also in the future. And that has proven really difficult, at least in the site that I've worked in Little Liberia. because it sits along the Long Island Sound. It sits on a floodplain, and historically it has been flooded, and those communities have been washed away, and they come back and they rebuild, and it's flooded again. And so even with the restoration of these 2 remaining houses, it's been like every winter, you just wonder, is this going to be the winter that takes out this whole project? And so I think that, at one point we looked to develop the land that the Housing Authority had left undeveloped, but it stalled on account of how we wanted to address the floodplain issue. And design-wise, they had very different ideas that led us far away from how the rest of that community would look. And so I think that these are really kind of some of the issues that, particularly when you look at Black spaces and people think, oh, how hard can it be to do those improvements? Oh, how hard, that's something I heard, at least in my, like, how hard can it be? People restore houses all the time. People revive neighborhoods. And the reality is that it goes back to, I think Jordan mentioned, and maybe Michael's also kind of thinking through these issues of, funding and, and getting the right teams in place, and having to contend with, city governance and state legislatures and, the environmental impacts. And so I think that when we do look at it, these are very real issues that are going to also just become more and more relevant as we experience a lot of climate refugees and shifts because of climate change in where we can go, how, to kind of be free of floods and fires and other environmental issues.
It's so interesting because I keep thinking about Jamila's initial question of what are the other methodologies that other individuals or groups are really practicing, and how can we learn from that? So I was recently actually listening to this podcast who was talking about what we can learn from informal settlements, right? And thinking about how often those spaces are thought of, afterthoughts, or truly so organic that they are quote unquote out of control and ever shifting, and that they need to be formalized, which would then give you access to the sort of funding that we're now talking about. But I am curious to hear about what are some of the organic practices, right, that folks have really tapped into to say, this is what we can build for ourselves over time using the materials that are, in our surroundings. And here's how we can be nimble about it so that, tomorrow's flood isn't going to completely wipe this out, or, a flood in 50 years, but rather we will be resilient every step of the way, and we'll figure out the different ways to do so over time, which is not necessarily a question, but definitely a thread that I've been hearing here as well.
I think it's Teresa Williamson in Rio who talks about the politics of envy that the rest of the city has in relationship to many of the favelas. Of course, you don't want to romanticize the situation. There are all kinds of real problems, real material problems, but so many elements of many informal settlements have all those aspects of the desirable, livable city that's being promoted now. Genuine community and closeness, walkability, variety, movement across all times of the day. There's a real sense in which many of these aspects are the promise of the desirable city of the future. I was being somewhat kind of ironic when I point to Port Harcourt as the city of the future, because more and more of cities, at least in the global south, are going to become more and more like Port Harcourt. So we really are in a contest for the future of the city. And the question is, how can we draw out and get inspiration from some of the improvisational aspects of these makeshift communities, many of which have to find ways of managing day to day, but have done so for decades, some of which are older than the city itself. So yeah, I mean, they're real challenges here, and I am I am somewhat suspicious of the kind of intellectual fascination of people like Rem Koolhaas, who ask, what can we learn from Lagos? But still, there is much to learn.
Ditto. I'm thinking back on one of Jordan's comments about how wonderful it is to hear you speak, Michael, because we're sort of always dawned by the comments that you end up making as well. And I did want to come back to a question that I think Jamila had, right, for Michael specifically. And perhaps this is a question for you all, as individuals that have worked very closely with specific communities, but would love to hear about, how are the Port Harcourt residents taking up leadership roles in the Shikoku projects? And is that also part of the project/model presently or in the future?
I mean, this is a really important question and a really difficult question. It was always the intention from the beginning, from when the project started to become a project, from the moment we started making deliberate strategic decisions. It was always our intention to create spaces, to open up spaces that we would step back from and then would be owned by other people. And that's something that's really difficult, because you come to realize that often you have resources that other people don't have. Other people also have resources that you don't have. But particularly when it comes to navigating the kinds of institutional spaces which involve telling stories that can secure resources, right? That particular scale of getting cash, and of framing what on the ground often feels like just muddling through day to day, trying to keep the wheels on the wagon, framing that as something that's coherent and compelling with a definite direction and goal. And I think actually, going back to the first question about who you tell stories to, I think one of the things that became clear when I first presented the story of the project to the people who made the project is that they then realize that they can grasp their own story and shape their own story as an instrument to use strategically. So, I'm here for a year, the first time in 10 years that I haven't been there. And I think part of that decision was to take a deliberate geographic distance and open up a space that others could step into and fill. So it's an open question.
And a really important one as well. So I think that it'll be interesting to perhaps in a year reach back out and hear about, how that shift really impacted the folks who are there now. Jordan, I am actually curious in this sort of thread of geographical distance, right? How have you been able to essentially reconnect with the individuals that you've been able to work on for many of these projects? I'm specifically thinking about, the For Malcolm X house and that greenhouse factor, but how do you come back to those spaces as well over time?
There is no disconnection is the easy answer, right? Because cats in the community aren't going to let you disconnect, right? So the very people that I got permission to do the projects in are going to hit me up and be like, where have you been? We need this, this still hasn't been done yet, X, Y, and Z. So that's the reason why I've stayed in Des Moines, specifically for it being geographically convenient. We have Omaha to the west, Minneapolis to the north, St. Louis to the south, Chicago to the east. And I'm fighting that right now, right? If I move out of the Midwest at my age with my family to the East Coast, how do I have that, that connection, that I can be at any of those sites within, 2 to 4 hours. And also, everybody's got your cell phone. So you really develop these long-term relationships where it's not just this grant project timeline. It's a lifelong connection to the community. So, if you're signing up for these big projects in these communities and promising things, you better expect to have phone calls at 8 or 9 o'clock at night for the next decade. And it's a lot of work, but beautiful work though, too.
I know, I was going to say, we love to see it. And that's the part of relationship building that I think is so often disconnected when we're doing larger projects, right? Or specific, like in my case, architectural projects sometimes as well, that building those relationships along the way is what's important. And then you can essentially, figure out how that does transform once you've moved away or are no longer as close and as tied to it as well. Jamila, I want to come back to this conversation that we had before about the interest that a mapping project like yours has sparked to other folks, including different municipalities and institutional entities, right? How have you been able to essentially balance that, or what have you noticed about that interest as well?
You know what? I'm so sorry, Wandy. My audio was going in and out. Do you mind just repeating the question?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my question was related to something that we had talked about previously, which was, with your mapping project, there was now an interest from different institutions and municipalities to really map out public art in their own settings. And so I was curious to hear from you how you've been able to navigate those interactions and conversations, and also what you've noticed about that.
Yeah. Oh, that's one that might get me in trouble, but I'll go there. So, unfortunately, how it started was that I was not included in those conversations with the local municipalities, and at the time, being like a junior faculty and being so heavily involved in community engaged, both teaching and research, it was just, it struck me as rather odd, because literally the day after, or the weeks after we launched our first project in 2018, upon which Art of the Matter is based, the city then announced that they were funding a project that was identical. And so my strategy at that point was to say, hey, would you like to partner? But then I pulled back a little. And this may speak to, I think, something that may be unique to the sites that I work in, is that they have a tenuous relationship with their city governance. And so I have found that even though my inclination is always to collaborate, that when it comes to certain aspects of collaboration, depending on where it falls, is to kind of pull back and to kind of just remain neutral, because the minute we had our launch, the city had a parallel launch of some new art installation, literally the same day, the same hour. And so it was this point at which you have to think about, okay, are people going to come to this event? Is it going to be successful and whatnot? But when people did come, I found that because we were not connected to the city in any way, they felt much more comfortable talking about some of the issues, particularly some of the artists who work on commission from the city felt about the direction that the public arts landscape was going in, or some of the limitations they felt. So I've seen a few of those projects pop up. And I kind of, at first I was advised by someone to send a cease and desist order. And they were like, that's copyright infringement or something. And I just said, you know what, I'm just going to remain neutral and continue to do the work that we're doing, because I think people in the communities that I've worked in, they need that space. They need that space to feel like they can come and they can kind of just release what it is how they feel about their relationship to the city. And so creating that kind of a safe space has been a goal. So I've actually pulled away from doing any direct collaborations, but I have learned a lot in the process about how to kind of protect the work that we do, so that it's, it doesn't get co-opted in ways we don't want it to.
Jamila, can I speak on that real quickly too, in reaction to that?
Mm-hmm.
We've had that situation happen multiple times throughout the Midwest. And I think there's a very militant, organizing tactic from city to city right now, from Des Moines to St. Louis to Kansas City to Minneapolis to Omaha and Chicago. But Chicago's so big it's doing its own thing a lot of the time, that when there is a misstep by the city or there's a misstep by another larger organization, we can band together with other collectives in other cities to demand accountability for that misstep. Because a lot of those other institutions that we're working with as well have a lot of the funding. So if we are holding them accountable in collaboration with these cross-city organizations, you can really push back in a meaningful way for things like that, because there's violence in that action that happened to you.
Yeah, I totally agree. And thank you for pointing that out, because I think that is what I'm missing in some instances, that it just was completely violent is the right word. And so I'm glad to know that there are opportunities to rally against it.
That's really wonderful. Yeah, it also makes me think a lot about trust building and what that looks like, right? On the internal sense, and then also when you are creating those different partnerships. So actually pushing back and holding accountability is a way to also build some sort of level of trust or just transparency in how different processes are taking place as well. Okay, so I think that we might still have time for a few questions. I'm uncertain, but I did still want to say, Jordan, Jamila, Michael, audience, if anybody else still has any, questions that they desperately want to ask in this moment, this is definitely the time to do so.
I mean, not so much a question, but just as we're rounding up, we're working in all of us, really fraught contexts. And we're making images or spaces which are striking and in their power offer a lot of promise. But almost inevitably, that promise is disappointed because of the scale of the challenges that they're set in. And one of the questions, I guess, is how to deal with an almost inevitable disappointment, how to continue to gather and mobilize and move forward, and to continue to make things that are beautiful and powerful, even when ultimately they don't work, they don't do what you wanted them to do.
I'm good on that's a tough question. I'm gonna let Jamila or somebody else answer that.
Well, I will just say, I think it resonates with something as I was listening to my co-panelists, and even to Wandy, to some of the parallels you were drawing between our projects. And one of the questions, or I don't think it's a question, but it's like a continuation of Michael's thoughts, which is that I was thinking we're all in the space of kind of imagining these alternative futures in spaces that were never meant to hold them and that actively work against them. And I think that is one of the things that I find extremely challenging, but then also exciting, because I want to see, I think I agree with Michael that there's so many things that you attempt and you try, and only maybe 2% make it into a publication or into, a talk. And then the rest you learn as learn from them and you move on. But I'm wondering if there's some space to think about, like, what does it mean to kind of just to commit to that kind of work? What kind of mindset do you have to have going in? What kind of habits do you have to build? Because I do think that's interesting, to be actively kind of working in a space that is working against you, or against a vision, you know.
I mean, in a place like Port Harcourt, and I guess many cities here too, I mean, that actively working against you is often immediate and overwhelming violence, right? Bulldozers, soldiers. And around the time when the project started, people fully expected to wake up and look out the window and see a bulldozer advancing on their home. So there's the question of how one manages to persevere, but there's also the immediate physical question. You know, how does one remain standing? How does one remain present in a space where many forces are trying to physically evacuate you from? So it's very difficult, and lots of the stories, you know, the stories about the ways in which putting yourself on the map is empowering, and which sound very convincing and compelling in many ways, are often inadequate, because it's not simply the case that putting yourself on the map necessarily empowers you. For example, once you put yourself on the map and expose yourself and make yourself visible, then you can really be wiped off the map. So these are intractable questions of social and spatial justice, and just how we continue, I think, is the question. How we proceed as if something were possible, as if one could do this, because one has to, because if one doesn't, one knows what will happen.
So I think it's actually incredibly tied to the title of this conference itself, right? We've been talking about from the mundane to the magical. And I think that it is in those moments where you perhaps even slow down, or where you are able to slow down and say, this is what we've been able to accomplish by doing these things on a regular basis in a response to the violence that we've been facing all the while as well. So we noticed that there are a few questions that just came through, so I'd love to ask them as well. So Garrett Ray asks, could you speak more to the reasons why we strayed from replicating the similarities between the design city and the informal city, favelas, shanty towns, etc.? If we're returning to these values, why did we leave them behind?
I'm not sure who the we is in the straying. I mean, just to say that at least in the global south, this is the dominant form of urbanism. In Nigeria, 80% of all physical development is outside of government control. So that's not just slums, informal settlements, poor people. That's banks, the governor's house, the shopping mall. It's just the reality of how our cities are being shaped. And the challenge is that the urban majority who are shaping the face of our cities are formally excluded from the processes of decision-making at municipal, state, national, international levels. And there's been a huge amount of work on trying to characterize this. I mean, for me, in a place like Nigeria, where there is no developmental state, where the state is predatory, the focus is really on making spaces that can, at least one hopes, create the conditions of possibility for the more deliberative and deliberate questions about urban design that we might raise in spaces like this?
I can speak at a much local level too, Garrett. You know, and this is pretty cut and dry too. A lot of the reasons why we're not able to continue the constructs that may or may not be working historically is because we're not allowed to at a city level, simply on code, right? So with the Malcolm X Memorial Project, I shouldn't say this, but I'm gonna, because this is how it is. I had to pay a third-party Italian contractor from the south side of Omaha to act as an agent or a cover to get the licensing and the permits to do the work in North Omaha, because the Black contractors didn't have the Class A and B permit licensing to do it, for one, because it takes a long time to get them, but for two, it's extremely expensive. So you're not even allowed to pour foundations for a garage in Omaha without a Class A or B contractor's license. So you can't do shit in your own community without the government coming and shutting the project down. So it's as simple as that, right? And in my situation, I'm speaking on a Midwest level. The cities just don't let Black people build things that we need without jumping through their hoops.
Yeah, I actually might defer to Wandy to correct anything I say wrong here. But I think my simplistic response would be, the urban renewal policies, and the redevelopment policies that literally, took those shanties, those favela-like settings within the United States, at least, and just put freeways through them and displaced people and segregated neighborhoods. And I think I saw a report, I think it was either, I don't want to get the publication wrong, Forbes or one of them, that does some really interesting kind of online reporting, but they were talking about how they're trying to piece the neighborhoods back together that were split by freeways. And these are Black neighborhoods. And so I think a lot of that, dispossession came through not only the dispossession of land and resources and housing, but as Jordan points out, even the ability to know your zoning laws, to be able to, retrieve permits. When we were working on the deconstruction of the Freeman homes in Bridgeport, we hired displaced workers, all young Black men and one woman who came and they got skills and training so that they could be the ones to deconstruct that site. But those things are not always easy to work out, particularly in cities that have not valued Black labor. And so I think those are some of the reasons that I see in the settings that I've worked in.
And Jamila, that's a great point too. And you could use St. Louis as another example too. If anybody knows the history of St. Louis, even if you have the zoning laws and you do all the things you're supposed to do, there's the act of eminent domain as well. So if you look at the history of St. Louis and you see an entire Black community be torn down, not only because of the interstate, but a mall, because it serves the greater good of the community, they'll tear down the entire Black community or push it out further. And there's I think 4 or 5 historically well-known cases in St. Louis that if anybody wants to just Google it, it's really mind-blowing what can happen under eminent domain.
Yeah.
I was going to say exactly that, right? That in the US context, many of these changes happened in the last century. So they're not as old as some folks might believe them to be, right? Where you can think about the post-industrial sort of development of cities and recognizing that as different building methods changed over time, you could build more. And so you could see that happen, block by block basis, folks being able to organically shift over that, right? Here in the Boston context, and this is definitely centered around a lot of the work that I've been doing, but looking at these vernacular building typologies like the triple decker, right, that are 3 stacked units on top of each other, and recognizing who are the folks that were actually able to build that at the end of the 19th century and also the beginning of the 20th century. These were replicable. They were built by immigrant working class families, right? And then you start to see a shift happen in the last century, right around the 1920s, where suddenly we were now taking a look at cities through maps like redlining maps and thinking about, where does it make sense to really hyper-focus and invest opportunities? White flight taking place in so many cities as well. And then everybody being subject to these exclusionary zoning laws and practices, and so many cities across the US having to say, how can we piece, to Jamila's words, piece these places together, because we need to counteract a lot of these challenges that happen now, which then make things like housing costs much higher, right? Because it takes so long to do so much of the things that, places can more easily do all over the world. So I think that can definitely lead us to a completely different type of discussion, which is incredible. So I want to pause here and say thank you to all of you for really engaging in such an incredible conversation. And I definitely look forward to more. And I don't know if any of you have any last thoughts before I hand things back to Somala, but thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I would say just to Garrett Ray's question, I think the heart of that question is why, why are we returning to them now, and in what ways, and how are we building opportunities so that these are not exclusive to certain demographics, I think is going to be the key thing. Like I'm thinking of tiny house communities and other forms in which we might see a return to some of these more informal spaces. And are they going to be inclusive? Is the financing going to be there for people of color, for low income people? All of those, I think that's where I think the question, should go, or yeah, we could unpack from there. Like you said, another conversation.